The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves across the settlement of Cedar Falls, Missouri, as 16-year-old Emma Catherine Sullivan stood at her bedroom window, watching the last golden rays of sunlight paint the rolling hills beyond their farm. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, while she listened to the familiar sounds of evening settling over their land, the gentle lowing of cattle returning to the barn, the creak of the windmill turning lazily in the breeze, and the distant sound of her adoptive mother Catherine humming hymns as she prepared supper in the kitchen below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma had lived this same peaceful routine for as long as she could remember, yet tonight something felt different. There was a restlessness in her chest that she couldn't quite explain, a feeling like she was waiting for something important to happen, though she had no idea what that might be. She pressed her palm against the cool window and wondered, not for the first time, about the life she might have lived if things had been different. The Sullivan family had taken her in when she was barely 3 years old, after what everyone in Cedar Falls called the terrible tragedy. Emma had heard whispered fragments of the story over the years, how a Comanche raiding party had attacked a wagon train heading west, how most of the travelers had been killed, and how she had been found days later by a cavalry patrol, wandering alone and half-starved in the wilderness. The soldiers had brought her to Cedar Falls, and Henry and Catherine Sullivan, who had been trying unsuccessfully to have children of their own for nearly a decade, had welcomed her into their home with open arms. Emma had grown up knowing she was adopted, but the Sullivans had never made her feel like anything other than their beloved daughter. Henry taught her to read and write, to tend the horses, and to handle a rifle with the same care he would have shown a son. Catherine shared her knowledge of cooking, sewing, and managing a household, always patient and encouraging even when Emma's attempts at domestic skills fell short of perfection. They had given her a comfortable, secure life filled with love and stability. Yet despite their kindness, Emma often found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror and wondering about the family she had lost. Her dark hair and olive skin stood in stark contrast to the fair complexions of her adoptive parents, and sometimes strangers in town would give her curious looks that made her acutely aware of how different she appeared from the other settler families. She had learned to ignore these glances and focus on the life she had been given, but the questions about her origins never completely disappeared. The most troubling part was the dreams. They came irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes on consecutive nights, but they were always vivid and strangely consistent. In these dreams, she was running through tall grass under a vast open sky, calling out for someone whose face she could never quite see. Sometimes she heard another voice calling back to her, a voice that sounded almost like her own, but not quite. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and a profound sense of loss that took hours to shake off. Emma had mentioned the dreams to Catherine once, when she was 12, but her adoptive mother had simply held her close and suggested that sometimes our minds create stories to fill in the gaps left by traumatic memories. It was better, Catherine had said gently, to focus on the blessings of the present rather than dwelling on a past that could never be recovered. Emma had accepted this wisdom and learned to keep her questions to herself, but the dreams continued. Now, at 16, Emma had settled into the rhythm of frontier life with the competence of someone who had known no other world. She could milk cows before dawn, help Henry repair fence posts, teach reading to the younger children at the settlement's one-room schoolhouse, and still have energy left to help Catherine preserve vegetables for the winter. The people of Cedar Falls had long since accepted her as one of their own, and she had friendships with most of the other young people in the area. Her closest friend was Jonathan Whitaker, the blacksmith's son, who was 18 and had been talking increasingly often about his plans to ask Henry Sullivan for permission to court Emma properly. Jonathan was a good man, honest, hard-working, and devoted to Emma in the steady, dependable way that made for successful marriages on the frontier. Emma cared for him deeply and knew that accepting his eventual proposal would mean a secure future in the community where she had grown up. It was exactly the kind of life that any sensible young woman in her position should want. So why did the prospect of settling down in Cedar Falls forever fill her with such inexplicable dread? Emma shook her head and turned away from the window, reminding herself that she had more immediate concerns to worry about. Tomorrow was the Harvest Festival, the biggest celebration of the year for their small community. Families would come from settlements within a 20-mile radius to share food, music, and stories as they marked the end of another successful growing season. Emma had spent weeks helping Catherine prepare special dishes for the festival, and she had a new dress that Catherine had sewn for the occasion, a beautiful blue cotton with tiny white flowers that brought out the unusual green flecks in Emma's dark eyes. The festival was also when Jonathan had said he planned to speak with Henry about their future together. Emma knew she should be excited about this conversation, but instead she felt a strange mixture of anticipation and anxiety that she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was simply the natural nervousness of a young woman on the verge of making such an important decision about her life's direction. As Emma made her way downstairs for supper, she found Henry and Catherine already seated at their familiar wooden table, heads bowed as Henry offered their evening prayer of gratitude. The scene was so perfectly normal, so reassuringly predictable, that Emma felt some of her earlier restlessness begin to fade. This was her family, her home, her life. Whatever strange feelings had been troubling her lately were probably just the result of too much time spent in solitary contemplation. "Emma, dear, you seem distracted tonight," Catherine observed as they began their meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "Are you feeling well?" Emma managed a smile and assured her adoptive mother that she was fine, just perhaps a bit nervous about tomorrow's festivities. Henry, a man of few words but deep perception, studied his daughter's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for examining sick livestock or damaged equipment. "It's natural to feel unsettled when big changes are coming," he said finally. "Jonathan spoke with me briefly today about his intentions. He's a good young man, Emma. He'll provide well for you and treat you with the respect you deserve." Emma nodded, knowing that Henry's assessment was correct in every practical way. Jonathan would indeed provide well for her. He was skilled at his trade, respected in the community, and genuinely kind. Any woman would be fortunate to marry him. The problem was that Emma couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his proposal would mean closing the door on something important, though she had no idea what that something might be. After supper, Emma helped Catherine clean the dishes while Henry went out to check on the animals one final time before bed. The kitchen was warm and cozy, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the log walls. Catherine worked beside her daughter in comfortable silence for several minutes before speaking. "You know, Emma, it's perfectly normal to feel uncertain about such a significant decision," Catherine said softly. "Marriage is a big step, and it's wise to think carefully before committing yourself." Emma looked up from the plate she was drying, surprised by her mother's insight. "I do care for Jonathan," she said. "It's just ... Sometimes I feel like there's something I'm supposed to be doing, somewhere I'm supposed to be, and I can't figure out what it is." Catherine set down the dish she was washing and turned to face Emma fully. "That feeling you're describing, I think many young people experience it. The world is so much bigger than what we can see from our little corner of it, and it's natural to wonder about the paths we didn't take." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But sometimes the most extraordinary life is built from ordinary moments of love and commitment. Sometimes the greatest adventure is learning to bloom where you're planted." Emma considered her mother's words as they finished their evening chores. Catherine was undoubtedly right. There was wisdom in appreciating the good life she had been given rather than constantly yearning for something undefined and probably unattainable. Yet as Emma prepared for bed that night, brushing her long dark hair and changing into her cotton nightgown, she couldn't entirely silence the voice in her heart that whispered there was more to her story than what she had discovered so far. The settlement of Cedar Falls had been built in a valley between two gentle hills, positioned to take advantage of a reliable stream that provided fresh water year-round and powered the small mill that ground grain for the surrounding farms. The community consisted of about 40 families, most of whom had arrived within the past decade as part of the westward expansion that was gradually pushing the frontier further into what had once been exclusively Indian territory. Emma's adoptive father, Henry, had been among the first settlers to establish a homestead in the area. He had come west from Ohio with dreams of owning enough land to build a prosperous farm, and after years of hard work, he had succeeded in creating exactly that. The Sullivan farm consisted of nearly 200 acres of fertile soil, a solid log house with glass windows that Catherine had insisted upon, a large barn that housed their livestock, and various outbuildings for storing equipment and preserving food. The success of families like the Sullivans had attracted other settlers to the area, and Cedar Falls had gradually developed the infrastructure necessary to support a growing community. In addition to Jonathan's father's blacksmith shop, the settlement boasted a general store, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week, a mill, and a trading post where local farmers could exchange goods with traveling merchants. Life in Cedar Falls followed the predictable rhythms of agricultural communities everywhere. Spring meant planting crops and tending to newborn livestock. Summer brought long days of cultivation and the constant work of maintaining buildings and equipment in the harsh frontier conditions. Autumn was harvest time, when the entire community came together to help each family bring in their crops before winter arrived. And winter meant months of careful rationing, indoor work like sewing and woodworking, and a kind of forced togetherness that either strengthened family bonds or drove people to the edge of madness. Emma had lived through 13 cycles of these seasons since joining the Sullivan family, and she knew her role in each phase of the yearly routine. She was particularly skilled at working with the horses, having developed an intuitive understanding of their behavior that impressed even the most experienced horsemen in the area. Henry often joked that Emma could calm a spooked horse faster than anyone he had ever seen, and neighbors frequently asked for her help when they were having trouble with difficult animals. This talent with horses had led to one of Emma's most cherished responsibilities, helping to train the young colts that Henry raised for sale to other settlers and passing traders. Emma loved working with these young animals, teaching them to accept a halter, respond to basic commands, and trust human handlers. There was something deeply satisfying about the process of building a relationship with a creature that had been born wild and gradually earning its confidence through patience and consistent kindness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma's favorite horse was a mare named Star, a beautiful chestnut with distinctive white markings on her face and legs. Henry had given Star to Emma for her 14th birthday, and the bond between girl and horse had been immediate and profound. Star seemed to understand Emma's moods intuitively, offering comfort when Emma was sad and sharing her excitement when Emma was happy. Many evenings, Emma would ride Star through the hills surrounding Cedar Falls, exploring the network of game trails that crisscrossed the wilderness and enjoying the sense of freedom that came from being alone with her thoughts in the vast landscape. These solo rides had also fed Emma's growing familiarity with the terrain beyond the settlement. She knew where to find the best wild berries, which streams had the clearest water, and where deer were most likely to gather at different times of day. This knowledge had proven useful on several occasions when hunting parties from Cedar Falls needed guidance. And Emma had developed a reputation as one of the most skilled trackers in the community, despite her young age. The skills Emma had developed, her way with horses, her knowledge of the surrounding wilderness, her ability to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather or the presence of wild animals, were not typical accomplishments for young women in frontier settlements. Most girls her age focused primarily on domestic skills that would prepare them for marriage and motherhood. Emma had learned those skills too, but her adoptive parents had also encouraged her to develop the kind of practical abilities that were essential for survival in frontier conditions. Regardless of gender, this unusual upbringing had given Emma a confidence and self-reliance that sometimes surprised people who didn't know her well. She could shoot accurately enough to bring down a deer for the family's table, navigate by the stars if necessary, and handle herself competently in situations that might overwhelm other young women. At the same time, she could also sew a fine seam, prepare a meal for a dozen people, and teach children to read with patience and skill. Emma's combination of traditional feminine accomplishments and frontier survival skills had made her an attractive prospect for marriage, but it had also set her apart from other young women in ways that sometimes left her feeling isolated. While her female friends spent their time discussing fashion, gossip, and their hopes for future husbands, Emma often found herself more interested in conversations about the political tensions between settlers and Indian tribes, the challenges of maintaining crops during drought years, or the stories that traveling traders told about life in the cities back east. These interests had drawn her into friendship with some of the older, more experienced members of the community, including Samuel Morrison, the trader who owned the general store. Samuel had traveled extensively throughout the frontier territories before settling in Cedar Falls, and he had a seemingly endless supply of stories about the different peoples and places he had encountered during his journeys. Emma loved listening to these tales, which fed her curiosity about the world beyond her. Small settlement. Samuel had also been the source of most of what Emma knew about the Indian tribes that lived in the surrounding territories. According to his accounts, there were several different groups in the area, each with their own customs, languages, and relationships with the expanding settler population. Some tribes had established peaceful trading relationships with communities like Cedar Falls, while others remained hostile to white encroachment on their traditional lands. The Comanche, Samuel had explained, were among the most formidable of the regional tribes. They were skilled horsemen and fierce warriors who had successfully resisted attempts to restrict their movements or force them onto reservations. Stories about Comanche raids were a constant source of anxiety for frontier settlements, and every family in Cedar Falls kept weapons readily available in case of attack. Yet Samuel had also told Emma that the Comanche were not simply the savage raiders that many settlers believed them to be. They had a complex society with sophisticated systems of leadership, trade, and cultural expression. They valued courage, loyalty, and skill in ways that weren't entirely different from the values held by frontier communities like Cedar Falls. The conflicts between Comanche bands and settler families often arose from misunderstandings and competition for resources rather than inherent evil on either side. These conversations with Samuel had given Emma a more nuanced understanding of the tensions that shaped life on the frontier, but they had also raised questions that she couldn't easily answer. What would have happened to her if the Comanche raiding party that had destroyed her original family had taken her captive instead of leaving her to wander alone in the wilderness? Would she have grown up with an entirely different set of values and beliefs? Would she have become a different person entirely? Emma tried not to dwell on such questions, but they surfaced periodically, especially during her solitary rides through the hills around Cedar Falls. Sometimes, when she was alone with Star in the vast prairie landscape, she would imagine what it might feel like to belong to a nomadic people who moved freely across the continent rather than being tied to a single plot of land. The fantasy both attracted and frightened her, representing a kind of freedom that was completely foreign to everything she had been taught about proper ways to live. As Emma finally drifted off to sleep on the night before the harvest festival, her last conscious thought was a silent prayer that tomorrow would bring clarity about her future with Jonathan and an end to the restless uncertainty that had been plaguing her for weeks. She had no way of knowing that the events of the following day would change her life in ways she could never have imagined, or that the questions about her identity that had troubled her for so long were about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible. The harvest festival dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the rolling Missouri hills look like they had been painted by an artist's brush. Emma woke before sunrise, as was her habit, but instead of the usual quiet anticipation she felt on festival mornings, there was an electric tension in the air that seemed to make even the birds sing more urgently than usual. By 7 o'clock, families from throughout the region were already arriving in Cedar Falls, their wagons loaded with contributions to the communal feast and their children dressed in their finest clothes. The settlement's main street, which on ordinary days saw perhaps a dozen people, was bustling with activity as neighbors greeted each other after weeks of isolated farm work and travelers shared news from distant settlements. Emma helped Catherine arrange their contributions on the long wooden tables that had been set up in the field beside the church. They had brought 3 apple pies, a large pot of venison stew, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and jars of preserved peaches that glowed like captured sunlight in the morning air. The sight of so much abundance spread across the tables never failed to fill Emma with gratitude for the prosperity their community had achieved through years of cooperative effort. Jonathan appeared at Emma's elbow just as she was adjusting the position of one of Catherine's pies, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a nervousness that made him fidget with the buttons on his best vest. His sandy hair had been carefully combed, and Emma could smell the bay rum soap he had used for shaving. Despite her own uncertainty about their future together, Emma felt a surge of affection for this earnest young man who was clearly working up the courage to take a step that would change both their lives forever. "You look beautiful this morning, Emma," Jonathan said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "That blue dress brings out something wonderful in your eyes." Emma smiled and thanked him, genuinely touched by his sincerity, even as she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. She was spared from having to make further conversation by the arrival of Reverend Michael Patterson, who began organizing the various activities that would fill the day. There would be competitions in marksmanship, horseback riding, and various domestic skills. The children would participate in sack races and games of tag. And as evening approached, there would be dancing to music provided by the Henderson brothers, who had brought their fiddles and banjo from their settlement 15 miles to the north. Emma found herself assigned to help with the horseback riding competition, a responsibility that suited her perfectly since it would keep her busy and provide a legitimate excuse to avoid the more intensive socializing that made her feel self-conscious. The competition was open to riders of all ages, with separate categories for different skill levels. Emma would be responsible for timing the races, ensuring the safety of both horses and riders, and helping to judge the more complex demonstrations of horsemanship that the experienced riders would perform. The morning passed quickly as dozens of participants tested their skills on the course that had been laid out in the pasture behind the church. Emma was impressed by the quality of riding she witnessed, particularly from some of the younger participants, who demonstrated natural talent that reminded her of her own early experiences with horses. She found herself thinking about how different communities developed their own traditions and techniques for working with animals, and wondering what kinds of horsemanship skills might exist among the Indian tribes that lived beyond the settled territories. It was during the lunch break, as Emma was helping to water and rest the horses that had been used in the morning competitions, that Samuel Morrison approached her with an expression of concern that immediately caught her attention. Samuel was not a man given to unnecessary worry, and Emma had learned to take his observations seriously. "Emma, I need to speak with you privately for a moment," Samuel said, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's something you should know about what I observed this morning." Emma followed Samuel to a quiet spot near the edge of the field, where they could talk without interruption. Samuel's weathered face was creased with lines of concentration as he chose his words. Carefully, "I've been watching the horizon since dawn," Samuel began. "It's an old habit from my trading days. You learn to keep an eye out for anything unusual, especially during gatherings like this when most of a community's population is concentrated in one place." Emma nodded, understanding the wisdom of such caution. Festivals and celebrations, while joyous occasions, also represented times of vulnerability for frontier settlements. "About an hour ago, I noticed smoke signals coming from the ridgeline to the west," Samuel continued. "They were subtle. Most folks wouldn't have recognized them for what they were. But I've seen enough Indian communication systems to know. Deliberate signals when I see them." A chill ran down Emma's spine despite the warmth of the autumn sun. "What kind of signals?" she asked. "The pattern suggested movement of a sizable group, probably heading in this direction," Samuel replied. "Could be a peaceful trading party, but the timing concerns me. Most tribes avoid approaching settlements during large gatherings unless they have specific business that can't wait." Emma processed this information, her mind immediately turning to the practical implications. "Have you told Henry or any of the other men?" "I mentioned it to your father and a few others," Samuel said. "We've agreed to quietly organize some additional security measures without alarming the families who are here to enjoy the festival. But I wanted you to know because of your particular skills with horses and your knowledge of the surrounding terrain." Emma understood what Samuel was implying. If trouble did arise, her ability to move quickly through the countryside and her familiarity with the network of trails and hiding places in the area could prove valuable. It was not a responsibility she had ever expected to shoulder, but she felt prepared to meet it if necessary. "What do you need me to do?" Emma asked. "For now, just stay alert and keep your horse saddled and ready," Samuel replied. "And if you notice anything unusual, any sounds or movements that don't belong, come find me immediately." Emma agreed to Samuel's request and returned to the festival activities, but the carefree mood of the morning had been replaced by a heightened awareness of her surroundings. She found herself scanning the tree line that bordered the settlement, listening for sounds that might indicate approaching riders, and mentally cataloging the locations of weapons and escape routes that could be important if the situation deteriorated. Afternoon competitions proceeded normally, with no visible signs of the tension that Emma knew was affecting at least some of the adult participants. Children played their games with undiminished enthusiasm, and the women continued their conversations about domestic matters and community gossip. Only the most observant visitors might have noticed that some of the men seemed more alert than usual, or that certain individuals were making excuses to check on horses and weapons with unusual frequency. Emma was judging a demonstration of precision riding when she heard the first sound that confirmed Samuel's fears. It was barely audible above the noise of the festival, a rhythmic drumming that could have been mistaken for thunder if the sky had not been perfectly clear. But Emma had heard that particular sound before, during Samuel's descriptions of approaching war parties, and she knew that dozens of horses were moving through the hills at considerable speed. She caught Samuel's eye across the field and saw him nod grimly, confirming that he had heard the same thing. Within minutes, the drumming became loud enough that other people began to notice it as well. Conversations gradually died down as participants in the festival turned their faces toward the western hills, trying to identify the source of the approaching sound. Henry Sullivan appeared at Emma's side, his rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. "Emma, I want you to help gather the children and move them toward the church," he said quietly. "Don't create panic, but make sure they're in a secure location. Emma nodded and began moving through the crowd, speaking quietly to parents and directing them to move their youngest children toward the stone church building that offered the best protection in the settlement. Most people complied without question, trusting the judgment of the community's leaders, even though the exact nature of the threat had not been explicitly announced. The drumming of horses' hooves grew steadily louder, and soon the first riders appeared on the ridge line that overlooked Cedar Falls. Even at a distance, Emma could see that this was indeed a large war party, with at least 30 mounted warriors arranged in a formation that spoke of military organization and serious intent. Feathers and war paint were visible even from several hundred yards away, and the afternoon sun glinted off weapons and ornaments that indicated this was not a casual trading expedition. Emma's heart began to race as she realized that the peaceful festival was about to be shattered by exactly the kind of confrontation that every frontier settlement feared most. She thought of Jonathan, who was somewhere in the crowd helping to organize the community's defensive response, and of Catherine, who was probably already preparing the church to serve as a refuge for women and children. Everything about her normal, predictable life was about to change in ways she could not begin to anticipate. The war party began descending the hillside at a controlled pace that suggested confidence rather than reckless aggression. Emma could see that the riders were maintaining formation and moving with the kind of disciplined coordination that indicated experienced leadership. This was not a random raid by young warriors seeking to prove their courage, but a deliberate action by a well-organized group with specific objectives. As the distance between the war party and the settlement decreased, Emma began to make out individual details that sent another chill through her body. The horses were magnificent animals, clearly bred and trained for both speed and endurance. The riders sat their mounts with the natural grace of people who had spent their entire lives on horseback, and their weapons, lances, bows, and rifles, were held with the casual competence of warriors who knew how to use them effectively. Samuel appeared beside Emma, his own rifle now openly displayed and his face set in grim lines. "Comanche," he said simply. "A significant war party, probably from one of the major bands in the region." Emma felt her throat tighten with fear, but also with a strange sense of recognition that she couldn't explain. Something about the approaching riders triggered memories that she couldn't quite access, fragments of images and sensations that seemed to come from a life she had never lived. "Emma, you need to get to the church with the other women," Samuel said urgently. "This is not a situation for civilians to be involved in." But even as Samuel spoke, Emma found herself transfixed by the sight of the approaching war party. One rider in particular caught her attention, a figure slightly smaller than the others, with long dark hair that flowed behind like a banner in the wind. Even at a distance, there was something about this rider's posture and movement that seemed familiar in a way that made Emma's heart pound with inexplicable excitement. The war party reached the edge of the settlement and formed a semicircle that effectively surrounded the festival area without appearing immediately threatening. Emma could see that the warriors were young men in their prime, their faces painted with designs that probably held specific meanings within their culture. Their leader, a tall man with an elaborate feathered headdress, rode forward several paces and raised his lance in what appeared to be a signal for attention rather than aggression. Henry Sullivan and several other men stepped forward to meet the Comanche leader, their own weapons visible but not actively threatening. Emma watched this tense diplomatic dance from her position near the church, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the festival ended peacefully or erupted into the kind of violence that could destroy their entire community. The Comanche leader began speaking in his own language, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent festival grounds. Although Emma could not understand his words, she could hear the authority in his tone and the careful modulation that suggested he was making some kind of formal announcement rather than issuing ultimatums or threats. Samuel, who had positioned himself where he could hear the exchange, began translating for the benefit of the other settlers. "He's saying that they've come seeking something that was lost," Samuel said quietly. "Something that belongs to their people, but was taken many years ago." Emma felt a strange tingling sensation in her limbs as she listened to this translation. The Comanche leader continued speaking, and Samuel's expression became increasingly puzzled as he struggled to follow the complex narrative. "He's talking about children," Samuel said finally. "2 children who were separated during a raid many years ago. He says one was lost to the white people, and they've come to find her." The blood drained from Emma's face as the implications of these words struck her with devastating clarity. She thought of her own mysterious origins, of the wagon train attack that had left her orphaned and alone in the wilderness, of the dreams that had haunted her for years with images of running through tall grass and calling for someone whose face she could never see. The Comanche leader continued his speech, and Emma could see him gesturing toward the assembled settlers as if he were searching for something specific. Other warriors began dismounting and moving through the crowd, their movements purposeful but not aggressive. They seemed to be looking for someone in particular, examining faces with the intensity of people conducting a careful search. Emma's legs felt weak as she began to understand what was happening. The raid that had destroyed her original family had not been a random act of violence, but something far more complex and personal. And now, 13 years later, the consequences of that long-ago tragedy were about to intersect with her carefully constructed life in Cedar Falls in ways that would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. One of the mounted warriors had been scanning the crowd systematically, and Emma felt his gaze settle on her with an intensity that made her entire body tremble. The warrior said something to his companions, pointing in Emma's direction, and several other riders turned to look at her as well. The rider with the long dark hair, the one who had first caught Emma's attention, suddenly spurred her horse forward and began moving directly toward where Emma stood frozen beside the church. As the distance between them decreased, Emma could see that this warrior was actually a young woman, probably close to her own age, with features that were strikingly similar to Emma's own. Emma's world began to spin as she stared at this approaching figure. The young woman's face was painted with red and black designs that couldn't disguise the familiar shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, or the determined set of her jaw. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not her current self, but the person she might have become if her life had taken a completely different path. The young Comanche woman reached Emma's position and dismounted in one fluid motion, her movements displaying the kind of natural athleticism that Emma recognized in her own relationship with horses. For a long moment, the 2 young women stood facing each other in silence, each studying the other's face with an intensity that blocked out everything else happening around them. Then, the Comanche woman spoke a single word in her own language, her voice filled with an emotion that transcended the barrier of different tongues. Emma didn't understand the word itself, but she understood its meaning with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than rational thought. Sister. Emma single quotes S knees buckled as the full impact of this revelation crashed over her like a wave. The dreams that had haunted her for years, the sense of incompleteness that had followed her through every day of her life in Cedar Falls, the restless feeling that she was meant for something beyond the peaceful existence she had been given. All of it suddenly made perfect sense. She was looking at her twin sister, the other half of herself that had been lost during that terrible raid 13 years ago. While Emma had been raised by loving adoptive parents in the safety and comfort of a frontier settlement, her sister had grown up among the Comanche, learning their ways and becoming one of their warriors. As Emma stared into eyes that were almost identical to her own, she realized that her life was about to change in ways that would dwarf any decision about marriage or settling down in Cedar Falls. The questions about her identity that had troubled her for so long were about to be answered, but those answers would bring new challenges that she could never have imagined. The festival continued to swirl around them, but for Emma, The world had narrowed to this single moment of recognition. This earth-shaking encounter with the sister she had never known existed, but had been searching for in her dreams. Every night for 13 years, the young Comanche woman reached out tentatively, her fingers trembling as they touched Emma's face, with the reverence of someone confirming a miracle. Her touch was gentle despite the calluses that spoke of a life spent handling weapons and horses, and Emma felt an electric shock of recognition that went beyond physical resemblance to something deeper and more primal. "Ayanna," the warrior woman whispered, and Emma somehow knew this was her original name, the name she had carried before becoming Emma Catherine Sullivan. The sound of it sent shivers through her entire body, awakening memories that had been buried so deep she had forgotten they existed. Emma's voice caught in her throat as she tried to respond. 13 years of speaking only English had made the Comanche language foreign to her tongue, but somewhere in the depths of her mind, fragments of words began to surface like bubbles rising from the bottom of a deep pool. "Dakota," Emma whispered. Back, the name emerging from some hidden chamber of memory. Her sister's eyes filled with tears at the sound of her true name spoken in Emma's uncertain but unmistakable voice. The reunion was interrupted by the approach of the Comanche war leader, whose painted face showed a mixture of satisfaction and profound emotion as he witnessed the moment he had apparently spent years orchestrating. He spoke to Dakota in rapid Comanche, his tone suggesting questions about Emma's identity and condition. Dakota responded with obvious excitement, gesturing toward Emma and speaking in a voice filled with joy and vindication. Even without understanding the language, Emma could sense that her sister was confirming what the war party had come to discover, that the lost daughter of their people had indeed been found among the white settlers. Samuel Morrison stepped forward cautiously, his rifle still ready, but his posture suggesting negotiation rather than confrontation. "Can you tell us what they want?" he asked Emma, apparently assuming that her obvious connection to the Comanche woman meant she could serve as a translator. Emma shook her head helplessly. "I don't understand everything they're saying," she admitted, "but I think this is my sister, my twin sister." The words sounded impossible even as Emma spoke them, but the evidence was undeniable. Dakota stood before her like a reflection from another world, sharing Emma's height, her bone structure, even the small scar on her left eyebrow that Emma had always assumed came from some childhood accident. She couldn't remember. Henry Sullivan pushed through the crowd of settlers, his face pale with shock as he took in the scene before him. Emma could see the moment when he began to understand the implications of what was happening, that the daughter he had raised for 13 years was being claimed by the very people who had originally taken her from her birth family. "Emma, step away from them and come over here," Henry commanded, his voice tight with fear and protective anger. "We don't know what they intend to do," but Emma found herself unable to move. Looking at Dakota was like seeing the answer to every question that had ever troubled her about her identity and origins. This was the face from her dreams, the voice that had been calling to her across the years of separation. Every instinct in her body was screaming that this was where she belonged, with this sister who shared not just her blood, but the mysterious sense of incompleteness that had haunted Emma throughout her life in Cedar Falls. Dakota seemed to understand Emma's internal struggle. She spoke again in Comanche, her voice gentle but urgent, and Emma caught enough words to understand that her sister was explaining their shared history and the circumstances that had led to their separation. The war leader, whom Emma was beginning to understand was some kind of chief or high-ranking warrior, addressed the assembled settlers in broken but functional English. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry significant weight. "Many seasons ago, white soldiers attack our camp," the chief began, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "They take women, children, kill many warriors. 2 small girls, daughters of my brother, lost in fighting. One girl was found by my people, raised as a Comanche warrior. Other girl ... double quotes. He gestured toward Emma. Lost until now. Emma felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she began to understand the true story of her origins. The wagon train attack that had orphaned her had not been an unprovoked raid by savage Indians, as she had always been told. It had been part of a larger conflict, possibly even retaliation for an earlier attack on a Comanche village by white soldiers. "We come in peace to bring our lost daughter home," the chief continued. "She belongs with her people, with her sister. This is a sacred obligation, cannot be ignored." Catherine Sullivan had worked her way through the crowd and now stood beside her husband, her face streaked with tears as she watched the daughter she had raised for 13 years, confronting a heritage that threatened to take Emma away from everything familiar and safe. "Emma is our daughter," Catherine said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've loved her and cared for her since she was 3 years old. She's part of our family, part of our community. You can't just take her away from the only life she's ever known." Emma looked back and forth between her adoptive parents and her newly discovered sister, feeling as though she was being torn in half by competing loyalties and desires. The Sullivans had given her everything: love, security, education, a place in their community. They had never made her feel like anything other than their beloved daughter, and the thought of leaving them filled her with anguish. But Dakota represented something equally powerful and infinitely more mysterious. She was the missing piece of Emma's identity, the answer to questions that had shaped Emma's entire understanding of herself. The pull Emma felt toward her sister was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not just emotional, but something deeper and more fundamental, as if her very soul was recognizing its other half. Dakota reached out and took Emma's hand, speaking to her in a mixture of Comanche and broken English. "Sister, you remember the night songs? The star stories our grandmother tell us before the soldiers come." Suddenly, Emma was overwhelmed by a flood of recovered memories. She could see herself as a small child, sitting beside a fire under a vast starry sky, listening to an elderly Comanche woman weave tales about the constellations that wheeled overhead. She remembered the sound of drums and singing, the smell of buffalo hide and sage smoke, the feeling of belonging to something larger and more ancient than anything she had experienced in her settler life. The memories came in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting glimpses of a lost world. She remembered learning to ride before she could walk properly, sitting on a horse with Dakota as they practiced the skills that would make them valuable members of their tribe. She remembered the games they had played, the secrets they had shared, the absolute trust and companionship that existed between them. But she also remembered the night everything changed. The sound of gunfire in the darkness, the screams of women and children, the chaos as their peaceful camp was transformed into a battlefield. She remembered being separated from Dakota in the confusion, running through tall grass as flames consumed the tipis behind her, calling out for her sister until her voice gave out and exhaustion finally overcame her. "I remember," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face as 13 years of suppressed trauma and loss finally surfaced. "I remember all of it." Dakota nodded, her own eyes wet with tears of joy and pain. "I never stopped looking for you," she said in careful English. "Every summer, every winter I ask the spirits to bring my sister back. Now they answer my prayers." The emotional intensity of the reunion was interrupted by practical concerns as Jonathan Whitaker stepped forward, his face set and determined. Lines that spoke of a young man prepared to fight for what he considered his. Emma's heart sank as she realized that her personal crisis was about to become even more complicated. "Emma is promised to me," Jonathan announced, his voice louder and more aggressive than Emma had ever heard it. "We're to be married, and I won't let a bunch of savages steal my bride away." The word savages hit the assembled Comanche warriors like a physical blow, and Emma could see hands moving instinctively toward weapons as the insult registered. The careful diplomatic balance that had been maintained since the war party's arrival was suddenly in danger of collapsing into violence. Dakota's expression hardened as she understood Jonathan's words, and when she responded, it was in fluent English that surprised everyone present. "My sister is not property to be owned by white man," she said coldly. "She is daughter of Chief Thunderhorse, granddaughter of medicine woman Windsinger. She has the blood of warriors, not the blood of a farmer's wife." Emma felt a shock of recognition as Dakota spoke these names. Chief Thunderhorse, she could suddenly see his face, weathered and kind, lifting her onto his horse and teaching her to read the signs that told stories in the landscape. Windsinger, her grandmother, the keeper of ancient wisdom and traditional medicines, who had sung her to sleep with lullabies that contained the accumulated knowledge of generations. "Emma, you don't have to listen to this," Henry said urgently. "These people are trying to confuse you, to make you forget who you really are. You're Emma Sullivan, you're our daughter, and you belong here with us." But even as Henry spoke, Emma could feel the truth settling into her bones like water soaking into dry earth. She was Ayanna, daughter of Thunderhorse, sister to Dakota. The life she had lived in Cedar Falls had been real and meaningful, but it had also been a kind of exile from her true identity and heritage. The chief spoke again, this time directing his words specifically to Emma. "Ayanna, your people need you. The old ways are threatened. The young ones forget the sacred knowledge. Your grandmother Windsinger is old now, her spirit ready to join the ancestors. She has kept the healing songs alive, waiting for you to return and learn them before she goes to the spirit world." Emma felt another wave of memory as the chief spoke of healing songs. She could suddenly recall sitting with her grandmother as the old woman gathered plants and explained their medicinal properties, teaching Emma the ancient chants that had to be sung while preparing certain remedies. The knowledge had been passed down through generations of women in their family, and Emma was apparently the designated heir to this sacred tradition. "If you do not return," the chief continued, "the healing songs die with Windsinger. Our people will lose something that can never be recovered." The weight of this responsibility settled on Emma's shoulders like a heavy blanket. She was not just being asked to choose between two families or two ways of life. She was being asked to choose whether an entire tradition of healing knowledge would survive or disappear forever. Dakota sensed Emma's internal struggle and spoke to her gently but urgently. "Sister, I know this is hard. I know the white family has been good to you. But our grandmother is dying, and only you can receive the sacred knowledge before she crosses over. If you wait too long, it will be lost forever." Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her, her adoptive parents, whose love and devotion had shaped her entire understanding of family. Jonathan, whose steady affection represented security and a predictable future. The settlers of Cedar Falls, who had accepted her as one of their own despite her obvious differences. And the Comanche warriors, who saw in her the fulfillment of years of searching and the hope of preserving their most sacred traditions. The choice before her was more than personal, it was historical. The decision she made in the next few minutes would determine not just the course of her own life, but the survival of knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries and the healing of wounds that had divided two peoples for generations. Emma closed her eyes and tried to listen to her heart beneath the chaos of competing voices and emotions. When she opened them again, she knew what she had to do, even though the decision would require a kind of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. She turned to face her adoptive parents, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks. "I have to go with them," she said quietly. "Not forever, but for now. My grandmother is dying, and there are things I need to learn from her before it's too late." The words fell into the crowd like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and dismay that spread outward from the point of impact. Catherine Sullivan let out a sob of despair, while Henry's face hardened into lines of angry determination. "Emma, you're making a terrible mistake," Henry said. "These people are filling your head with stories and superstitions. You have a real life here, a future with people who genuinely care about you. Don't throw it all away for some primitive fantasy." But Emma had already turned toward Dakota, her decision made despite the pain it was causing everyone she cared about. Her sister's face lit up with joy and relief as she realized that Emma was choosing to reclaim her Comanche heritage, at least temporarily. "I'll come back," Emma promised, looking directly at Catherine and Henry. "I swear to you I'll come back. But first, I have to discover who I really am and where I came from. I have to learn what my grandmother needs to teach me." Dakota was already leading a horse forward, a beautiful paint mar that seemed to recognize Emma despite their years of separation. As Emma approached the animal, more memories surfaced. This was her horse from childhood, the companion she had learned to ride on, somehow preserved and cared for throughout all the years of searching. Emma swung herself onto the horse's back with a natural grace that surprised even her, muscle memory taking over as if she had never stopped riding. In the Comanche style, the feeling of being mounted on her childhood horse, surrounded by her sister and the warriors of her birth tribe, was like awakening from a long dream into vivid reality. As the war party prepared to depart, Emma took one last look at the life she was leaving behind. The harvest festival had been transformed into something resembling a funeral, with her adoptive family and friends standing in shocked silence as they watched her prepare to ride away with people they had been taught to fear and distrust. Jonathan stepped forward one final time, his face desperate with the realization that he was losing the woman he had planned to marry. "Emma, please," he pleaded. "Don't do this. Come back to us where you belong." Emma felt her heart breaking as she looked at this good man who had offered her a life of security and conventional happiness. But the call of her heritage was stronger than the promise of comfortable predictability, and she knew that she would regret forever not taking this chance to discover her true identity. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she said softly. "I truly am. But this is something I have to do." With that, Emma turned her horse toward the western hills and began the journey that would take her back to a world she had lost 13 years ago, toward a grandmother who held the key to ancient wisdom and into a life she had never dared to imagine but had somehow always been preparing for. The journey westward toward the Comanche camp began at sunset, with Emma riding between Dakota and the war chief whose name she had learned was Broken Arrow. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and distant wood smoke, and as they crested the first ridge beyond Cedar Falls, Emma turned in her saddle for one final glimpse of the settlement that had been her home for 13 years. The festival lanterns were still glowing in the gathering dusk, but the celebration had clearly ended with her departure. Even from this distance, Emma could see clusters of people standing motionless in the field where hours earlier there had been dancing and laughter. The sight filled her with a guilt so profound that she almost turned her horse around and rode back to apologize for the pain she had caused. Dakota must have sensed her sister's emotional turmoil, because she guided her horse closer and began speaking in the low, rhythmic cadence that Emma was beginning to remember as the traditional way of telling stories during long rides. The words were in Comanche, but Dakota spoke slowly and used gestures that helped Emma follow the meaning. She was telling the story of their separation, but from the perspective of someone who had lived through it, rather than someone who had suppressed the memories. According to Dakota's account, the attack on their village had not been unprovoked. White settlers had been encroaching on traditional Comanche hunting grounds for months, and tensions had escalated when a group of young warriors had raided a supply train in retaliation for the killing of sacred buffalo herds. The cavalry response had been swift and brutal. They had struck the village at dawn, when most of the warriors were away on a hunting expedition. Women, children, and elderly people had been caught defenseless, and the soldiers had shown little mercy in their desire to send a message to other Comanche bands. Emma listened to this version of events with growing horror and confusion. In Cedar Falls, she had always been told that Indian raids were acts of savage violence committed by people who had no respect for civilization or human life. But Dakota's story painted a different picture, one of desperate people defending their way, of life against invaders who sought to destroy everything they held sacred. During the chaos of the attack, Dakota explained, their mother had given each twin a special necklace made of turquoise and silver, telling them that as long as they wore these talismans, they would always be able to find each other no matter how far apart they might be separated. Dakota reached into her shirt and withdrew such a necklace, its stones glowing in the firelight with an inner luminescence that seemed almost magical. Emma's hand went instinctively to her own throat, where she suddenly remembered wearing something similar as a very young child. The necklace had been lost during her wandering in the wilderness, but she could clearly recall the weight of it against her chest and the comfort she had drawn from touching the smooth stones when she was frightened or lonely. As they rode deeper into the night, passing through landscape that grew increasingly wild and untamed, Emma began to understand the magnitude of what she had undertaken. She was not simply visiting her birth family for a brief reunion. She was entering a completely different world with its own laws, customs, and expectations. The skills that had made her valuable in Cedar Falls might prove useless or even dangerous in Comanche society. Broken Arrow seemed to sense her apprehension, because he began speaking to her in English, his voice carefully modulated to convey authority tempered with understanding. Ayana, you feel fear about what waits ahead. This is natural for one who has lived so long away from her people. But you must understand, the blood of warriors flows in your veins. The wisdom of medicine women lives in your spirit. These things cannot be destroyed by years among the white settlers. Emma wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying everything the Sullivans had taught her about right and wrong. Henry and Catherine had raised her to value hard work, honesty, education, and peaceful cooperation with her neighbors. The life she was riding toward seemed to embrace values that were fundamentally different: warfare, nomadic wandering, and a spiritual relationship with the natural world that many settlers would consider pagan superstition. Yet, as the night progressed and they continued their westward journey, Emma found herself experiencing a strange sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with rational thought. The rhythm of the horse beneath her, the vast expanse of stars overhead, the sound of night birds calling across the prairie, all of it felt familiar in a way that her comfortable bedroom in Cedar Falls never had. Dakota had been watching her sister's face in the moonlight, and she seemed to understand the conflicting emotions that Emma was experiencing. "Sister," she said gently, "you worry that choosing our people means betraying the white family who raised you. But wisdom is not about choosing one truth over another. Wisdom is about understanding that many truths can exist together." Emma considered this perspective as they made camp for the night in a sheltered valley beside a small stream. The Comanche warriors moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a secure perimeter and tending to their horses with the kind of expertise that could only come from a lifetime of nomadic living. There were no permanent structures, no accumulated possessions beyond what could be carried on horseback. Yet within minutes they had created a comfortable and defensible temporary home. Emma found herself assigned to help with the care of the horses, a responsibility that felt both familiar and foreign. She knew how to handle the animals, but the Comanche methods were subtly different from what she had learned in Cedar Falls. Their approach emphasized developing a spiritual bond with each horse, treating the animals as partners and allies rather than simply as tools for transportation. Under Dakota's patient instruction, Emma began relearning the songs and rituals that accompanied the daily care of horses in Comanche culture. Each horse had its own song, composed to reflect its individual personality and spiritual essence. Riders were expected to sing to their mounts regularly, maintaining the emotional connection that made the legendary Comanche horsemanship possible. As Emma attempted to remember the song that belonged to her childhood horse, fragments of melody began emerging from the buried memories of her early years. The notes felt awkward on her tongue at first, but gradually the rhythm became more natural, and she could see her horse's ears pricking forward with recognition and pleasure. The experience was deeply moving, but it also highlighted how much Emma had lost during her years of separation from her birth culture. The songs, the stories, the intricate knowledge of plants and animals and weather patterns, all of it would have to be relearned, and Emma was beginning to understand that the process might take years rather than weeks. When the evening meal was prepared, Emma discovered another layer of complexity in her situation. The food was delicious: roasted rabbit seasoned with wild herbs, a rich stew made from dried buffalo meat and prairie vegetables, and a kind of bread made from ground seeds that she had never tasted before. But the social dynamics surrounding the meal were governed by protocols that she didn't understand. Women and men ate separately, with the warriors discussing matters of tribal politics and strategy, while the few women in the party, Emma, Dakota, and an elderly medicine woman named Bright Moon, shared their own conversations about family, news, and spiritual matters. Emma struggled to follow the rapid Comanche dialogue, catching perhaps every third word and relying on context and gestures to fill in the gaps. Bright Moon seemed particularly interested in Emma's experiences during her years with the white settlers. Through a combination of Comanche, English, and sign language, the older woman questioned Emma about the customs and beliefs she had encountered in Cedar Falls. Some of Emma's answers clearly surprised Bright Moon, particularly her descriptions of formal education and the role of women in settler society. In return, Bright Moon began explaining some of the changes that had occurred in Comanche society during Emma's absence. The pressure from expanding white settlements had forced many bands to alter their traditional patterns of movement and hunting. Sacred sites had been destroyed or made inaccessible by the construction of farms and towns. Young people were increasingly drawn to the material advantages of white civilization, and some were abandoning their heritage entirely. Emma listened to these accounts with growing dismay. She had left Cedar Falls hoping to reconnect with a timeless way of life that would provide answers to her questions about identity and purpose. Instead, she was discovering that her birth culture was itself in crisis, struggling to survive in a rapidly changing world that seemed hostile to everything it represented. The most troubling revelation came when Bright Moon explained the circumstances surrounding Wind Singer's illness. Emma's grandmother had not simply grown old and weak. She had been deliberately poisoned by a rival medicine woman who disagreed with Wind Singer's increasingly friendly attitude toward white settlers. The poison was slow-acting but ultimately fatal, and it could only be countered by a specific combination of healing songs and medicinal plants that Wind Singer had never shared with anyone except Emma during their brief time together before the attack on the village. Emma felt a chill of horror as she realized the implications of this information. Her grandmother's life depended on Emma's ability to remember healing knowledge that she had learned as a 3-year-old child and then forgotten for 13 years. The pressure of this responsibility was almost overwhelming, especially since Emma wasn't even certain she could successfully transition back to Comanche life after so many years of living as a white settler. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a scout who had been monitoring their back trail since leaving Cedar Falls. The young warrior spoke urgently to Broken Arrow in rapid Comanche, his expression grave and his gestures indicating significant concern about something he had observed. Emma caught enough words to understand that they were being followed, but it was Dakota who provided the full translation. "A group of white men left Cedar Falls several hours after we departed," she explained quietly. "They are well armed and moving fast, probably hoping to catch up with us before we reach our main camp." Emma's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Henry Sullivan, Jonathan Whitaker, and probably several other men from Cedar Falls were attempting a rescue mission, convinced that Emma had been kidnapped against her will and needed to be saved from her captors. Their good intentions could easily lead to a violent confrontation that would result in death on both sides and destroy any possibility of peaceful resolution. Broken Arrow was already making tactical decisions, assigning scouts to monitor the pursuing party and selecting warriors to serve as a rear guard if fighting became necessary. Emma could see the transformation that came over the Comanche men as they shifted from peaceful travelers to potential combatants. Their relaxed postures became alert and predatory. Their movements gained the fluid precision of experienced fighters preparing for battle. Emma knew she had to do something to prevent the catastrophe that was developing, but she wasn't sure what options were available to her. She couldn't abandon her mission to reach Windsinger before it was too late, but she also couldn't allow the men of Cedar Falls to ride into what might become a deadly trap. The solution came to her with startling clarity. She would have to ride back and intercept the pursuing party herself, using her unique position as someone trusted by both groups to negotiate a peaceful resolution. It was a dangerous plan that could easily go wrong in multiple ways, but it was the only approach that offered any hope of preventing violence. When Emma explained her intention to Dakota and Broken Arrow, both of them immediately opposed the idea. Dakota argued that Emma was too important to the survival of their healing traditions to risk losing her in a confrontation with angry white men. Broken Arrow pointed out that Emma's years of living among the settlers might have compromised her loyalty to her birth people, making her a potential security risk if she was allowed to communicate freely with the pursuing party. But Emma was determined to prevent bloodshed, and she gradually convinced them that her plan offered the best chance of resolving the crisis without violence. She would ride back with a small escort, meet with the men from Cedar Falls under a flag of truce, and explain the true nature of her departure. If she could convince them that she had left voluntarily and would return safely after completing her mission, they might agree to abandon their rescue attempt. The negotiations took most of the night, with various members of the war party expressing concerns about allowing someone who had been raised by white settlers to serve as a diplomatic intermediary. Emma's cultural loyalties were questioned. Her ability to speak authoritatively for Comanche interests was doubted, and her understanding of the complex political implications of the situation was thoroughly examined. But Dakota defended her sister passionately, arguing that Emma's unique background actually made her the perfect person to bridge the gap between the two cultures. She understands both worlds, Dakota insisted. She can speak to the white men in ways they will trust, and she can represent our interests without creating fear or misunderstanding. As dawn approached, Broken Arrow finally agreed to Emma's plan, but with strict conditions. She would be accompanied by 2 experienced warriors who would ensure her safety and monitor her negotiations with the settlers. The meeting would take place in open terrain where treachery would be difficult to conceal. And if Emma failed to resolve the situation peacefully within a specified time limit, the war party would assume she had been captured or killed and would respond accordingly. Emma accepted these terms, knowing they represented the best compromise she was likely to achieve. As she prepared for what might be the most important diplomatic mission of her life, she tried to summon the confidence she would need to convince 2 groups of armed and suspicious men to trust each other, enough to avoid a potentially devastating conflict. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been a simple frontier woman whose biggest concern was whether to accept a marriage proposal. Now she was preparing to serve as a peace negotiator between 2 cultures that had been enemies for generations. With the lives of people she cared about hanging in the balance of her success or failure. As Emma mounted her horse and prepared to ride toward what she hoped would be a peaceful resolution rather than a violent confrontation, She reflected on how quickly her life had been transformed by the discovery of her true heritage. The quiet existence she had known in Cedar Falls seemed like a distant memory, replaced by responsibilities and challenges that would test every skill and instinct she possessed. The morning sun was painting the prairie, grass gold when Emma spotted the dust cloud that marked the position of the pursuit party from Cedar Falls. She had been riding hard for 3 hours with her 2 Comanche escorts, covering ground at a pace that pushed both horses and riders to their limits. Now as they approached the designated meeting place, a small rise overlooking a natural amphitheater formed by converging creek beds, Emma felt her stomach tighten with anxiety about the confrontation ahead. Her escorts, 2 seasoned warriors named Red Hawk and Stormwalker, had maintained professional silence during most of the ride. But as they prepared to make contact with the white settlers, Red Hawk finally spoke his concerns in careful English. "White men see only enemies when they look at Comanche," he said grimly. "They will not trust words from Indian mouths, even if those words come from a woman they raised as a daughter. You must be prepared for them to see treachery where none exists." Emma nodded, understanding the wisdom behind his warning. The men pursuing them were operating under assumptions about Indian behavior that had been shaped by years of frontier conflict and cultural misunderstanding. They would be expecting deception, violence, and barbarism, not reasoned negotiation from someone they considered to have been corrupted by prolonged contact with savages. Stormwalker was scanning the surrounding terrain with the practiced eye of a warrior who had survived numerous battles. "The white men choose good ground for meeting," he observed. "Open approaches, clear fields of fire, difficult to set ambush. They understand tactics, even if they do not understand diplomacy." Emma could see the truth of his assessment as she studied the landscape ahead. Henry Sullivan might be a farmer rather than a professional soldier, but his years on the frontier had taught him to think strategically about potentially dangerous situations. The meeting place he had selected would give his party significant advantages if the negotiation turned violent. As they crested the final ridge before the rendezvous point, Emma got her first clear view of the men who had ridden from Cedar Falls to rescue her. Henry was there, as she had expected, along with Jonathan Whitaker and 6 other men she recognized from the settlement. They were all armed with rifles and positioned in a defensive formation that spoke of careful planning and serious determination. What surprised Emma was the presence of Samuel Morrison, the traitor who had first warned of the approaching Comanche war party. Samuel's inclusion in the rescue mission suggested that the settlers were hoping to use his knowledge of Indian customs and languages to facilitate communication. It was a sign that they intended to try diplomacy before resorting to violence, which gave Emma hope that a peaceful resolution might be possible. The white men had spotted the approaching Comanche riders as well, and Emma could see them making final preparations for the confrontation. Weapons were checked and positioned for quick access. Horses were arranged to provide cover if fighting broke out, and the men arranged themselves in positions that would allow them to concentrate their firepower effectively. Emma's heart was pounding as she rode down the slope toward the meeting ground, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her attempt to bridge 2 worlds would succeed or fail catastrophically. Everything she had learned about diplomacy, persuasion, and human nature would be tested in the most high-stakes negotiation of her life. Henry Sullivan stepped forward as Emma approached, his face a mixture of relief at seeing her alive and anger at the circumstances that had brought them to this confrontation. "Emma, thank God you're safe," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground. "We've come to take you home where you belong." Emma dismounted slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening as she had been instructed by Red Hawk. "Henry, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she replied, using the calm but authoritative tone she had learned from watching Samuel Morrison negotiate with difficult customers. "I wasn't kidnapped or coerced. I made a conscious choice To go with these people, because they are my family." The word family hit the assembled settlers like a physical blow, and Emma could see the immediate reaction in their faces. Henry's expression hardened with denial and anger, while Jonathan looked as though she had struck him personally. Several of the other men began muttering among themselves, and Emma caught fragments of words like brainwashed and turned savage. Samuel Morrison stepped forward, his trader's instincts recognizing the delicate nature of the situation. "Emma, we understand that meeting these people has been confusing for you," he said carefully. "But you need to think clearly about what you're doing. These aren't your real family. The Sullivans are your real family. They're the ones who raised you, who love you, who've given you everything you have." Emma felt a surge of frustration at the assumption that her connection to her birth heritage was somehow less valid than her relationship with her adoptive family. "Samuel, you've traded with the Comanche for years," she replied. "You know they're not the mindless savages that people in Cedar Falls believe them to be. They have families, traditions, and knowledge that's just as valuable as anything we have." In the settlement, Red Hawk and Storm Walker had positioned themselves where they could observe both Emma and the white men, their hands resting casually near their weapons, but not in openly threatening positions. Emma could sense their growing tension as the conversation continued, and she knew that any sudden movement or aggressive gesture could trigger the violence she was desperately trying to prevent. Jonathan stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion and his voice cracking with desperation. "Emma, I don't care about any of this political nonsense," he said. "I love you, and I thought you loved me too. We had plans for our future together, a wedding, children, a good life in Cedar Falls. Are you really going to throw all of that away for some fantasy about being an Indian princess?" The dismissive way Jonathan characterized her heritage as a fantasy stung Emma more than she had expected. She realized that despite years of living with the questions about her origins, the people closest to her had never truly understood the depth of her need to discover her identity. To them, her curiosity about her past had been nothing more than an amusing quirk, not a fundamental aspect of who she was. "Jonathan, what I had with you was real and important," Emma said gently. "But it was built on an incomplete understanding of who I am. I can't make a life with you or anyone else until I've learned to make peace with all the parts of myself." Henry Sullivan had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, and now his frustration boiled over into open anger. "Emma, stop talking nonsense and get away from those savages before they decide to scalp us all," he commanded in the voice he had used when she was a disobedient child. "You're coming home with us right now, and we're not going to stand here debating about it." Emma felt a flash of her own anger at Henry's assumption that he could simply order her to abandon her quest for identity and understanding. "Henry, I'm not a child anymore," she replied firmly. "I'm 16 years old, and I have the right to make my own decisions about my life. I appreciate everything you and Catherine have done for me, but I won't be forced to choose between my past and my future." The assertion of independence seemed to surprise Henry, who had clearly expected Emma to submit to his parental authority, as she always had before. For a moment, he seemed uncertain how to respond to this new version of the daughter he thought he knew completely. "Samuel." Morrison recognized the deadlock that was developing and tried to find a compromise that might satisfy both sides. "Emma, what if we agreed to let you visit with these people for a few days, just to satisfy your curiosity?" he suggested. "Then you could come back to Cedar Falls with a better understanding of your heritage, but still be able to live the civilized life you're meant for." Emma shook her head, knowing that Samuel's well-intentioned suggestion completely missed the point of what she was trying to accomplish. "Samuel, my grandmother is dying," she explained. "She's the keeper of healing knowledge. That will be lost forever if I don't learn it from her before she dies. This isn't about satisfying curiosity. It's about preserving something sacred and irreplaceable." Red Hawk had been following the conversation as best he could with his limited English, and now he decided to contribute his own perspective to the negotiation. "White men do not understand sacred obligations," he said in careful but clear English. "Ayana must learn grandmother's medicine songs before the old woman's spirit goes to Sky World. This is a law that cannot be broken." The mention of medicine songs and Sky World provoked exactly the reaction Emma had feared from the men of Cedar Falls. Several of them exchanged glances that spoke of their conviction that Emma was being indoctrinated into pagan superstition that would corrupt her Christian soul. The cultural divide between the two groups seemed to widen with every word that was spoken. Jonathan's desperation finally overcame his restraint, and he stepped forward aggressively, reaching out as if to grab Emma's arm and pull her away from the Comanche warriors. "Emma, I'm not going to let you destroy your life over some heathen nonsense," he declared. "You're coming home with me right now." Storm Walker reacted instantly to what he perceived as a threat to Emma's safety, his hand moving to the handle of his war club with the fluid speed of a trained fighter. Red Hawk stepped forward as well, placing himself between Emma and the advancing settler. The careful diplomatic balance that had been maintained throughout the negotiation suddenly collapsed into the potential for immediate violence. "Stop!" Emma shouted, throwing herself between the two groups before weapons could be drawn. "Everyone just stop and think about what you're doing." Her intervention succeeded in freezing the confrontation at its most dangerous point, but Emma could see that the situation remained volatile. The men from Cedar Falls had their hands on their rifles, while the Comanche warriors were poised to draw their traditional weapons. One wrong move or misinterpreted gesture could still trigger a battle that would leave people dead on both sides. Emma turned to face the settlers, knowing that she needed to assert her authority in the strongest possible terms to prevent catastrophe. "Henry, Jonathan, all of you, if you truly care about me, you'll respect my decision and let me go," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I'm not abandoning you or rejecting everything you've taught me. I'm trying to become a complete person who understands all parts of her heritage." Henry's face was pale with the realization that his attempt to rescue Emma had failed completely. "Emma, if you go with them, you'll never come back," he said quietly. "They'll turn you into something you're not, and will lose you forever." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes as she heard the genuine grief in Henry's voice. She loved this man who had been a father to her for 13 years, and the thought of causing him pain was almost unbearable. But she also knew that she couldn't live the rest of her life wondering about the road not taken. "Henry, I promise you that I will come back," she said, reaching out to touch his hand despite the tension of the situation. "But I need to do this first. I need to learn from my grandmother and understand where I came from before I can decide where I'm going." Samuel Morrison had been watching the entire confrontation with the calculating eye of someone who had negotiated his way out of numerous dangerous situations. Now he stepped forward with a proposal that might offer a way out of the deadlock. "What if we establish some kind of regular communication?" Samuel suggested. "Emma could send messages back to Cedar Falls letting us know she's safe and well. And when she's finished with her spiritual education, we could arrange for her safe passage back to the settlement." Emma looked at Red Hawk and Storm Walker, trying to gauge their reaction to this proposal. The two warriors exchanged a brief conversation in Comanche, then Red Hawk nodded slowly. "This thing can be done," Red Hawk agreed. "But white men must understand, Ayana is under the protection of our people now. Any attempt to take her by force will be answered with force." The threat was delivered in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that made it all the more chilling. Emma could see the settlers processing the implications of what Red Hawk had said, that any future rescue attempts would be treated as acts of war with potentially devastating consequences for Cedar Falls. Henry Sullivan looked around at his companions, reading the uncertainty in their faces. as they contemplated the risks of continuing their confrontation with the Comanche warriors. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat as he accepted that his daughter's mind was made up, and that further pressure might only make the situation worse. "Emma, I want you to know that your mother is heartbroken," Henry said quietly. "She's been crying since you left, and I don't think she'll stop until you come home." The mention of Catherine's grief hit Emma like a physical blow, and for a moment she wavered in her resolve. The image of her adoptive mother weeping alone in their kitchen was almost enough to make her abandon her quest and return to the safety and predictability of her former life. But then she thought of Win Singer lying on her deathbed with ancient knowledge locked inside her failing body, waiting for a granddaughter who might never arrive in time to receive the sacred teachings. The weight of that responsibility steadied Emma's resolve and reminded her why she had made this difficult choice in the first place. "Tell Catherine that I love her and that I'll be back as soon as I can," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell her that everything she taught me about kindness and courage is helping me now, and that I'll always be grateful for the love she's shown me." Jonathan made one final attempt to change Emma's mind, his voice breaking with desperation and disbelief. "Emma, please don't do this," he begged. "I'll wait for you. I'll wait as long as it takes. Just promise me you'll remember who you really are and come back to us." Emma looked at this good man who had offered her a life of security and conventional happiness, and she felt her heart breaking for the pain she was causing him. "Jonathan, I'll never forget what you mean to me," she said softly, "but I can't promise to come back unchanged. This journey is going to transform me in ways I can't predict, and when I return, I might be someone very different from the person you fell in love with." With those words, Emma turned away from the life she had known and walked back toward Red Hawk and Stormwalker, who were already preparing to depart. The confrontation was over, but Emma knew that the real challenges lay ahead as she prepared to enter a world that was both familiar and foreign, where she would have to prove herself worthy of the heritage she was claiming. As the three riders disappeared over the ridge, heading toward the Comanche camp and the dying grandmother who held the key to ancient wisdom, Emma felt the weight of multiple worlds pressing down on her shoulders. She was no longer simply Emma Sullivan of Cedar Falls, but she wasn't yet fully Ayanna of the Comanche either. She was caught between identities, carrying the hopes and fears of two peoples who had been enemies for generations. Riding toward a destiny she could not yet comprehend, the Comanche camp materialized from the prairie landscape like something from a dream, its collection of painted tipis arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and spiritual significance. Emma had been riding for 2 days since the confrontation with the rescue party, covering vast distances across terrain that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Now, as they approached the temporary village that housed Broken Arrow's band, she felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that made her hands shake on the reins. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the afternoon sky, and Emma could hear the sounds of daily life: children playing, women singing as they worked, horses nickering in the distance. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that contradicted everything she had been taught about savage Indians living in primitive conditions. The camp was clearly well organized and prosperous, with evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship visible in the decorated lodge covers and the quality of the horses grazing nearby. Dakota rode beside her sister as they entered the village, pointing out significant landmarks and explaining the social protocols that governed Comanche camp life. "The largest tipi belongs to Broken Arrow and his family," she explained. "The one with the eagle symbols belongs to our uncle, Swift River, who leads the hunting parties. And the one decorated with healing plants ... double quotes." She paused, her voice becoming more solemn. "That is where our grandmother waits for you." Emma's heart began beating faster as she realized how close she was to the moment she had been anticipating and dreading since leaving Cedar Falls. Wind Singer represented the key to understanding her heritage and identity, but she was also a dying stranger, whose expectations Emma might not be able to fulfill. The weight of responsibility for preserving ancient knowledge felt almost crushing as Emma contemplated the possibility of failure. The arrival of the war party created a stir of excitement throughout the camp, with people emerging from their lodges to greet the returning warriors and examine the unexpected visitor they had brought with them. Emma was acutely aware of being studied by dozens of curious eyes, all of them taking in her unusual appearance and trying to reconcile her obvious mixed heritage with her presence among their people. Children were particularly fascinated by Emma's settler clothing and the way she sat her horse in a style that combined Comanche techniques with white methods. Some of the younger ones had never seen a person who straddled both worlds so visibly, and they followed at a respectful distance as Dakota led Emma toward the center of the camp. An elderly man with silver hair and deeply lined features approached their small procession, his bearing suggesting significant authority within the tribal hierarchy. Dakota dismounted immediately and greeted him with obvious respect, speaking rapidly in Comanche while gesturing toward Emma. The old man's eyes never left Emma's face as he listened to Dakota's explanation, and Emma could see him searching for resemblances to people he had known. "This is our grandfather, Chief Thunderhorse," Dakota explained in English. "He is the father of our father, and he has been searching for you since the day you disappeared." Emma slid down from her horse with as much grace as she could manage, trying to remember the proper protocols for greeting tribal elders that were slowly surfacing from her buried memories. She approached Thunderhorse with her eyes lowered respectfully, waiting for him to acknowledge her before speaking. Thunderhorse studied her face for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek with a hand that trembled slightly with age and emotion. When he spoke, his voice was thick with feelings that transcended the barrier of language. "Ayana," he said simply, and Emma heard 13 years of grief and hope compressed into the single word. "You have come home." The reunion with her grandfather was profoundly moving, but Emma was keenly aware that time was running short for the more crucial meeting that lay ahead. Thunderhorse seemed to understand her urgency, because after only a few minutes of emotional conversation, conducted through translation and gestures, he led her personally to the tipi where Wind Singer lay waiting, the interior of the healing lodge was dim and filled with the complex aromas of medicinal plants, burning sage, and other substances that Emma couldn't identify. It took several moments for her eyes to adjust to the reduced light, but gradually she began to make out the figure lying on a bed of buffalo robes in the center of the space. Wind Singer was ancient beyond anything Emma had imagined. Her face, so deeply lined and weathered that she seemed to embody the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Yet her eyes were still bright and alert, and they fixed on Emma with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight to her soul. The old woman spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but Dakota translated her words with reverent precision. "She says that she has been keeping the healing songs alive in her heart, waiting for you to return and receive them. She says that the spirits told her you would come back before her time was finished." Emma approached the bed slowly, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being asked of her. She was supposed to learn complex medical knowledge and spiritual practices that had been developed over centuries, and she had to master them quickly enough to preserve them before Wind Singer died. "Grandmother," Emma said softly, using one of the few Comanche words she remembered clearly. "I'm here, but I don't know if I'm worthy of what you want to teach me. I've lived away from our people for so long that I've forgotten most of our ways." Wind Singer smiled at the sound of her native language on Emma's lips, and when she replied, her voice carried more strength than her frail appearance would have suggested. Dakota continued translating, her own voice filled with awe at her grandmother's words. "She says that the spirits do not make mistakes when they choose who will carry sacred knowledge. She says that your time among the white people has not weakened. your connection to our traditions. It has prepared you to serve as a bridge between two worlds. The healing knowledge you learn here will help both our people and theirs. Over the next several hours, Wind Singer began the process of transferring her accumulated knowledge to Emma. The teaching method was unlike anything Emma had experienced. In the schoolhouse at Cedar Falls, instead of books and written lessons, Wind Singer used songs, stories, and hands-on demonstrations to convey information about medicinal plants, healing rituals, and the spiritual practices that supported traditional Comanche medicine. Emma discovered that her childhood exposure to these traditions had created a foundation that remained intact despite years of neglect. As Wind Singer sang the healing songs, melodies began returning to Emma's memory with startling clarity. When her grandmother showed her how to prepare certain herbal remedies, Emma's hands seemed to remember the proper techniques without conscious effort. The most remarkable aspect of the teaching process was the way it awakened Emma's intuitive understanding of the natural world. Wind Singer showed her how to read the subtle signs that indicated which plants would be most potent at different times of year, how to sense the spiritual energy that made certain locations particularly powerful for healing work, and how to establish the kind of deep connection with patients that allowed healing to occur on multiple levels simultaneously. As the evening progressed, Emma began to understand that she was receiving much more than medical knowledge. Wind Singer was transmitting an entire worldview that saw health and illness as reflections of spiritual balance or imbalance, that understood healing as a collaborative process between healer, patient, and the natural forces that surrounded them both. The teaching continued through the night and into the following day, with brief breaks for food and rest, but no significant interruptions. Emma found herself entering an altered state of consciousness where the boundaries between past and present seemed to dissolve. She could see herself as the 3-year-old child who had first learned these songs, and she could simultaneously envision herself as an adult healer, carrying on traditions that stretched back through countless generations. Dakota remained present throughout the teaching process, serving both as translator and as a witness to the transfer of sacred knowledge. Emma could see the pride and relief in her sister's eyes as it became clear that Emma was successfully absorbing the complex information that Wind Singer was sharing. The fear that generations of healing wisdom might be lost forever was gradually being replaced by confidence that the traditions would survive into another generation. On the 3rd day of intensive instruction, Wind Singer began teaching Emma the most sacred and powerful of the healing songs, the ones that were said to be capable of calling spirits back from the edge of death and restoring balance to souls that had been damaged by trauma or spiritual attack. These songs required not just memorization, but deep understanding of the spiritual principles they embodied. Emma struggled with this advanced material, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of mastering techniques that could literally mean the difference between life and death for future patients. But Wind Singer was patient and encouraging, adjusting her teaching methods to accommodate Emma's hybrid background and the unique challenges she faced as someone returning to her heritage after years of separation. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when Wind Singer asked Emma to demonstrate her understanding by attempting to heal a young warrior who had been injured in a hunting accident. The man had suffered a deep wound that was showing signs of dangerous infection, and the other healers in the camp had been unable to stop the spread of the poisoning. Emma approached the healing with tremendous anxiety, knowing that failure might result not only in the warrior's death, but also in the loss of confidence in her ability to carry on her grandmother's work. But as she began singing the healing songs and preparing the medicinal plants according to Wind Singer's instructions, she felt something remarkable happening within her consciousness. The knowledge she had been absorbing over the past several days suddenly coalesced into intuitive understanding. She could sense the spiritual imbalance that was preventing the warrior's body from fighting off the infection, and she could feel the specific combination of songs, medicines, and energy work that would be needed to restore his natural healing capacity. The healing session lasted several hours, with Emma working in a state of focused concentration that seemed to tap into sources of knowledge and power that existed beyond her conscious mind. Win Singer watched from nearby, occasionally offering guidance or encouragement, but mostly allowing Emma to develop confidence in her own abilities. When the session was complete, the warrior's fever had broken, and the angry red lines of infection that had been spreading up his arm were visibly receding. Emma felt a profound sense of accomplishment and connection to her heritage, but she was also humbled by the realization of how much more she still needed to learn. Singer smiled with deep satisfaction as she observed the successful healing. And when she spoke to Emma, her voice carried a note of finality that indicated their formal teaching relationship was drawing to a close. "She says that you have proven yourself worthy of the sacred knowledge," Dakota translated. "She says that the healing gift runs strong in your blood, and that you will be able to help many people if you continue to develop your abilities with patience and wisdom." But Win Singer was not finished with her revelations. Over the next several hours, she shared information that completely transformed Emma's understanding of her family history and her role in the ongoing conflict between white settlers and Native American tribes. According to Win Singer, Emma and Dakota were not simply ordinary Comanche children who had been separated during a random raid. They were descendants of a powerful lineage of medicine women who had served their people for generations, and their births had been prophesied by tribal elders as heralding a time when the traditional knowledge would need to be preserved and new ways to survive the challenges of the changing world. The attack on their village had not been coincidental, Win Singer explained. Rival tribes and even some members of their own band had opposed the prophecy and the special status it conferred on the twin sisters. The timing of the cavalry assault had been influenced by information provided by these internal enemies, who had hoped that the destruction of the village would eliminate the prophesied children and allow traditional power structures to remain unchanged. Emma's separation from the tribe and her upbringing among white settlers had not been a tragedy to be mourned, but rather a necessary part of fulfilling the prophecy. She had been destined to learn the ways of both peoples so that she could eventually serve as a bridge between worlds that seemed destined for perpetual conflict. "Your grandmother says that your real work is just beginning," Dakota explained. As Win Singer's revelations continued, "She says that the healing knowledge you have learned here is only the foundation for a much larger mission. You are meant to establish a place where people from both cultures can come for healing, where the wisdom of our people can be combined with the best knowledge that white medicine has to offer." Emma felt overwhelmed by the scope of what was being asked of her. The idea of creating some kind of intercultural healing center seemed impossibly ambitious, especially given the deep prejudices and fears that existed on both sides of the cultural divide. But Win Singer was not finished with her surprising revelations. She explained that arrangements had already been made to support Emma's mission, including the establishment of treaties with several white settlements that would allow her to practice traditional healing without interference from authorities, who might otherwise view such activities as pagan superstition. The most shocking revelation came when Win Singer revealed that Samuel Morrison, the trader from Cedar Falls, had been serving as a secret intermediary between progressive leaders in both communities, who were working to find peaceful solutions to the ongoing conflicts. Samuel's knowledge of Comanche customs and his presence at the harvest festival had not been coincidental. He had been monitoring the situation and waiting for the right moment to facilitate Emma's return to her people. "Your white father, Henry Sullivan, is not as ignorant of your true heritage as you believed," Dakota translated as Win Singer continued her explanations. "He and your white mother knew more about your background than they revealed to you. They have been working with Samuel Morrison and others to prepare for the day when you would choose to reclaim your Comanche identity." Emma felt a mixture of relief and betrayal as she processed this information. The Sullivans had not been as surprised by her departure as they had appeared, and their rescue mission had been more about testing her resolve than about actually forcing her to return to Cedar Falls. Against her will, the realization that her adoptive parents had been secretly supporting her quest for identity while maintaining the appearance of opposition was both comforting and disturbing. Emma wondered how many other aspects of her life had been influenced by forces she had never suspected, and she began to understand that her sense of making independent choices might have been more illusory than she had realized as the sun set. On Emma's 5th day in the Comanche camp, Wind Singer gathered her remaining strength for one final ceremony that would formally transfer the sacred healing knowledge to her granddaughter and release her own spirit to join the ancestors who were waiting for her in the spirit world. The ceremony was attended by the entire band, with people traveling from considerable distances to witness the historic moment when the ancient traditions would be passed to a new keeper, who embodied the hope for a more peaceful future between two worlds that had been enemies for far too long. The ceremony marking Wind Singer's final transfer of sacred knowledge began at sunset on the 7th day of Emma's stay in the Comanche camp. The entire band had gathered in a great circle around a specially prepared fire that burned with flames of unusual colors, created by the addition of sacred herbs and minerals that had been collected from holy sites across the Great Plains. Emma found herself positioned at the center of this circle, wearing traditional healing regalia that had belonged to her grandmother and the generations of medicine women who had come before her. The weight of the ceremonial clothing was significant. Layers of decorated buckskin, necklaces of turquoise and silver that told the stories of her lineage, and a headdress adorned with eagle feathers that represented her connection to the spirit world. But more than the physical weight was the emotional and spiritual burden of accepting responsibility for preserving knowledge that stretched back through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Wind Singer had spent the entire day preparing herself for the ritual that would formally release her spirit to join her ancestors. Her frail body had been painted with sacred symbols, and she wore the most elaborate healing regalia that the band possessed. Despite her obvious weakness, her eyes burned with fierce determination to complete this final act of service to her people. Chief Thunderhorse served as the master of ceremonies, his deep voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as he recited the ancient words that had been spoken at such gatherings for generations, beyond counting. The ritual was conducted entirely in Comanche, but Emma found that her intensive week of instruction had restored enough of her childhood language skills to follow most of what was being said. The ceremony began with a recounting of the lineage of medicine women that had culminated in Wind Singer's life and teachings. Each name was spoken with reverence, along with stories of the healing miracles and spiritual insights that had marked their contributions to tribal history. Emma listened with growing awe as she realized the depth and richness of the tradition. She was being asked to continue. When Thunderhorse reached the story of Emma and Dakota's birth, his voice took on special significance as he described the prophecy that had foretold their special role in bridging the gap between Comanche and white cultures. According to the ancient predictions, twin daughters would be born to the healing lineage at a time when the traditional ways were threatened by unprecedented change. One twin would be raised among the people to preserve the old knowledge in its purest form, while the other would live among the whites to learn their ways and understand their hearts. Emma glanced at Dakota, who stood in the circle of witnesses with tears streaming down her painted face. For the first time, Emma fully understood the sacrifice her sister had made by remaining with their people while Emma grew up in the safety and comfort of Cedar Falls. Dakota had borne the responsibility of maintaining their heritage alone, never knowing whether her lost twin would ever return to share the burden. The formal transfer of healing knowledge involved a complex series of rituals that tested Emma's mastery of everything Wind Singer had taught her. She was required to demonstrate her ability to prepare specific medicines, to sing the healing songs with proper intonation and spiritual power, and to call upon the spirits that assisted in the most powerful healing work. Each test was more challenging than the last, requiring Emma to integrate the traditional knowledge she had learned with the practical skills and scientific understanding she had acquired during her years in the white world. The most difficult challenge came when she was asked to heal a spiritual ailment that had no physical symptoms. A young woman who had lost the will to live after the death of her children in a cavalry attack several months earlier. Emma approached this case with deep humility, knowing that she was attempting to address trauma that went far beyond anything she had encountered during her brief training. But as she began the healing ceremony, drawing upon both Comanche spiritual practices and the psychological insights she had gained from her broader life experience, she felt the presence of something larger than herself guiding her efforts. Healing session lasted through most of the night, with Emma working in a state of profound spiritual connection that seemed to tap into the accumulated wisdom of all the medicine women who had come before her. When dawn finally broke, the traumatized woman was sitting up and speaking for the first time in months, her eyes clear and focused as she began to reconnect with the world around her. Wind Singer watched this final demonstration of Emma's abilities with obvious satisfaction and pride. When the healing was complete, she summoned the strength to rise from her bed and approach her granddaughter. For the ceremony's climactic moment, the transfer of spiritual authority was marked by Wind Singer placing her hands on Emma's head and speaking a long prayer in the oldest form of Comanche that Emma had ever heard. The words seemed to vibrate with power that went beyond their literal meaning, and Emma felt something fundamental shift within her consciousness as the sacred responsibility was formally passed from one generation to the next. As Wind Singer completed the prayer, she removed the most precious of her healing tools, a medicine bag that had been passed down through their family for more generations than anyone could count. The bag contained sacred objects whose significance was known only to the medicine women who had carried them, and Emma felt the weight of centuries of tradition as it was placed in her hands. The old ways and the new ways must learn to dance together, Wind Singer whispered in English, her voice barely audible but her meaning crystal clear. You are the bridge between worlds, granddaughter. Build carefully, for many it will depend on what you create. With those words, Wind Singer smiled peacefully and allowed herself to sink back onto her bed of buffalo robes. Her breathing became increasingly shallow as the assembled crowd maintained their vigil, and just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the greatest medicine woman of her generation quietly released her spirit to join the ancestors who were waiting for her. The mourning period that followed Wind Singer's death lasted for 3 days, during which Emma participated in traditional grieving rituals while also beginning to plan for the challenging mission that lay ahead of her. The responsibility she had accepted was daunting in its scope. She was expected to establish some kind of healing center that could serve both Comanche and white communities while preserving the sacred knowledge she had inherited. The practical challenges seemed almost insurmountable. Where could such a center be located? How could she overcome the deep prejudices and fears that existed on both sides of the cultural divide? What kind of support would she need to make such an ambitious project successful? The answers began to emerge during a series of meetings with tribal leaders who had been planning for this moment for years. Samuel Morrison arrived at the camp on the second day of mourning, accompanied by representatives from several white settlements who had been secretly negotiating agreements that would make Emma's mission possible. The most surprising participant in these discussions was Henry Sullivan, whose presence at the Comanche camp represented a dramatic departure from everything Emma had believed about her adoptive father's attitudes toward Native Americans. Henry's weathered face showed signs of the emotional struggle he had endured since Emma's departure, but his voice was steady and determined as he addressed the assembled leaders. Emma is my daughter in every way that matters, Henry declared, speaking to both Comanche chiefs and white negotiators. I've watched her grow up with questions about her heritage that I couldn't answer, and I've seen how those questions have shaped her into the remarkable young woman she's become. If this is the path she's chosen, then she'll have my support, and the support of our entire community. Catherine Sullivan had remained in Cedar Falls, but she had sent a letter with Henry that brought tears to Emma's eyes as she read her adoptive mother's words of love and encouragement. The letter revealed that Catherine had always known this day might come, and that she had spent years preparing herself emotionally for the possibility that Emma would choose to follow a different path than the conventional frontier life they had planned for her. The negotiations that followed were complex and delicate, involving representatives from multiple Comanche bands, several white settlements, territorial officials, and even representatives from the federal government who had traveled from Washington to participate in what was being hailed as a groundbreaking peace initiative. The location that was eventually selected for Emma's Healing Center was a natural hot springs area that had been considered sacred by various tribes for generations, but had recently been claimed by white settlers who were unaware of its spiritual significance. The springs were located at the intersection of several important travel routes, making them accessible to people from both cultures while being far enough from major settlements to avoid the kind of daily friction that might undermine the center's mission. The agreement that was hammered out over several days of intense negotiation established the Hot Springs area as a neutral zone where people from any background could come, seeking healing without fear of violence or discrimination. Emma would be recognized as the primary healer and administrator of the center, with authority to establish whatever practices and protocols she deemed necessary to serve patients from multiple cultures. Financial support for the center would come from a combination of sources, including tribal contributions, donations from progressive white communities, and federal funding that had been authorized as part of a broader peace initiative. Emma would be assisted by a carefully selected staff that included both traditional Comanche healers and white medical practitioners who were willing to learn from indigenous healing methods. The most revolutionary aspect of the agreement was the establishment of a formal training program that would teach the principles of cross-cultural healing to students from both backgrounds. Emma would serve as the primary instructor, sharing the sacred knowledge she had inherited while also learning from the medical innovations that white civilization had developed. Jonathan Whitaker surprised everyone by volunteering to be among the first white students to enroll in this training program. His motivations were complex, partly a desire to remain connected to Emma despite the end of their romantic relationship, but also a genuine interest in learning healing techniques that might benefit the people of Cedar Falls and other frontier communities. "I may not understand why Emma made the choices she did," Jonathan explained to the assembled negotiators, "but I've seen the results of her healing work, and I want to learn whatever she's willing to teach. If this knowledge can help people, then it doesn't matter whether it comes from Indian traditions or white science." The transition period that followed the signing of the formal agreements was marked by intensive preparation for the establishment of the Healing Center. Emma found herself traveling frequently between the Comanche camp and various white settlements, serving as both a healer and a diplomat as she worked to build the relationships that would be essential for her missions. Success. Each community presented unique challenges and opportunities. Some Comanche bands were suspicious of any collaboration with whites and questioned whether traditional knowledge should be shared with people who had been their enemies for generations. Some white settlements were equally skeptical about the wisdom of trusting their health to pagan healing methods that they didn't understand. But Emma gradually built credibility with both groups by demonstrating the practical effectiveness of her healing techniques. She successfully treated conditions that had resisted conventional medical approaches, and she showed remarkable skill at adapting traditional methods to address health problems that were more common in white communities than among nomadic tribes. Most dramatic demonstration of her abilities came when she was called upon to treat a cholera outbreak that had struck a settlement near the planned location of the healing center. Working alongside the community's doctor, Emma used a combination of traditional Comanche medicines and isolation procedures that she had learned from her adoptive parents to contain the spread of the disease and save lives that would otherwise have been lost. The success of this intervention convinced even the most skeptical observers that Emma's unique background and training could provide genuine benefits to people from both cultures. Word of her healing abilities spread rapidly through the network of traders, travelers, and official communications that connected frontier communities, and requests for her services began arriving from increasingly distant locations. Dakota played a crucial role in these early successes, serving as Emma's primary assistant and cultural interpreter. The bond between the twin sisters had grown even stronger during their weeks of working together, and they had developed an almost telepathic understanding that made them extraordinarily effective as a healing team. "My sister understands the white world in ways that I never could," Dakota explained to tribal leaders who questioned the wisdom of sharing sacred knowledge with outsiders. "But she has also proven that her heart remains connected to our people and our traditions. Together, we can build something that honors both worlds while serving the needs of all people who come to us for help." The construction of the healing center began in the spring following Winsinger's death, with workers from both cultures contributing their skills to create a facility that combined the best architectural elements from multiple traditions. The main building incorporated the circular design principles of traditional Comanche structures, while using construction techniques and materials that would ensure durability and comfort for patients accustomed to white standards of housing. Separate areas were designated for different types of healing work, including spaces for traditional ceremonies, modern medical procedures, the preparation of medicines from both cultures, and the training of students who would carry on the center's mission. Gardens were planted with medicinal herbs from various traditions, and careful attention was paid to maintaining the spiritual significance of the natural hot springs that formed the heart of the complex. Emma worked tirelessly during the construction period, dividing her time between supervising the building project, treating patients who had begun arriving even before the center was officially opened, and developing the curriculum that would be used to train future cross-cultural healers. Grand opening of the healing center took place exactly 1 year after Winsinger's death, with representatives from dozens of communities attending a ceremony that celebrated both the completion of the construction and the formal beginning of Emma's mission as a bridge between worlds. Chief Thunderhorse offered the opening prayer in Comanche, asking the spirits to bless the center and the work that would be done there. Henry Sullivan spoke on behalf of the white communities that had contributed to the project, expressing hope that the center would serve as a model for peaceful cooperation between peoples who had too often seen each other as enemies. But it was Emma's own address to the assembled crowd that captured the true significance of what had been accomplished. Standing before an audience that included Comanche warriors and white settlers, government officials, and tribal elders, she spoke in both languages about the vision that had guided their efforts. "1 year ago, I was a lost young woman who didn't know where she belonged," Emma began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Today, I stand before you as someone who has learned that belonging isn't about choosing one identity over another. It's about embracing all the parts of yourself and using them to serve something larger than yourself." She continued by describing the healing philosophy that would guide the center's work, an approach that honored the wisdom of traditional methods while remaining open to new knowledge from any source that could benefit patients. The goal was not to prove that one culture's healing methods were superior to another's, but to create a synthesis that drew upon the best insights from multiple traditions. "The sacred knowledge that my grandmother entrusted to me doesn't belong to me alone," Emma explained. "It belongs to all people who are committed to healing the wounds that divide us, and to building a future where our children can learn from each other instead of fearing each other." The first patients to be treated at the center represented a cross-section of the diverse communities that had supported its creation. They included a Comanche warrior suffering from wounds that had never properly healed, a white settler woman struggling with depression following the loss of her family, and a mixed blood trader whose identity crisis had manifested as a variety of physical ailments that no single healing tradition had been able to address. Each case required Emma to draw upon different aspects of her training and experience, demonstrating the value of her unique background in bridging cultural divides. The Comanche warrior responded well to traditional healing songs, combined with herbal treatments that incorporated plants unfamiliar to tribal medicine. The settler woman benefited from a combination of Comanche spiritual practices and the kind of practical counseling that Emma had learned from observing her adoptive mother's approach to helping troubled neighbors, but it was the mixed blood trader who presented the most complex challenge and achieved the most dramatic results. His healing required Emma to address the psychological trauma of being caught between two worlds, a struggle she understood intimately from her own experience. By helping him to see his mixed heritage as a source of strength rather than confusion, Emma was able to resolve physical symptoms that had plagued him for years. As word of these early successes spread, the center began attracting patients from increasingly distant locations. Native American tribes that had never trusted white medicine began sending their most challenging cases to Emma, while white communities that had been skeptical of savage healing methods started referring patients who had exhausted conventional treatment options. The training program that Emma had established proved equally successful, attracting students from diverse backgrounds who were eager to learn cross-cultural healing techniques. Jonathan Whitaker emerged as one of the most dedicated students, his practical experience as a blacksmith giving him valuable insights into the kind of physical therapy that could complement traditional healing approaches. Samuel Morrison became an unofficial administrator for the center, using his extensive network of trading contacts to coordinate the complex logistics of serving patients from multiple cultures while maintaining the diplomatic relationships that kept the peace between communities that had historically been enemies. The success of the healing center had broader implications that extended far beyond the treatment of individual patients. It served as a proof of concept for the possibility of peaceful cooperation between Native American tribes and white settlers, providing a model that began to be replicated in other locations across the frontier. Government officials who had initially viewed the center as an interesting experiment began to see it as a potential solution to some of the intractable conflicts that had plagued relations between whites and Indians for generations. Tribal leaders who had been skeptical about collaboration with whites began to recognize the practical benefits of sharing knowledge and resources with communities that had previously been viewed only as threats. Most importantly for Emma personally, the center provided a way to honor all aspects of her complex heritage, while serving a purpose that gave meaning to the struggles and sacrifices that had brought her to this point. She was no longer torn between competing identities. She had found a way to integrate them into a coherent whole that allowed her to serve both the family that had raised her and the people who had given her birth. As Emma stood in the doorway of the healing center on a crisp autumn evening, exactly 2 years after her dramatic departure from the Cedar Falls Harvest Festival, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The sunset painted the western hills in shades of gold and crimson, and she could hear the sound of children playing, both Comanche and white children, who had become friends through their families' shared connection to the center. Dakota emerged from the main building, her arms full of medicinal plants that she had been preparing for the next day's treatments. The bond between the twin sisters had grown even stronger through their shared work, and they had developed an almost telepathic understanding that made them extraordinarily effective as a healing team. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently? Dakota asked, speaking in the mixture of Comanche and English that had become their private language. If you had stayed in Cedar Falls and married Jonathan, or if I had been the one who was lost and raised by white people. Emma considered the question as she watched a group of mixed families sharing an evening meal at one of the outdoor tables that had been set up near the hot springs. Henry and Catherine Sullivan were there, having become regular visitors to the center and enthusiastic supporters of its mission. Thunder Horse was teaching one of the white children how to weave grass into small figures, while Jonathan was deep in conversation with a Comanche healer about the medicinal properties of a plant they had been studying. I think the spirits knew exactly what they were doing when they arranged our separation and reunion, Emma replied finally. We each learned what we needed to learn to fulfill our purpose. The prophecy wasn't just about healing individual patients. It was about healing the wounds between our peoples. As the evening deepened and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of belonging and purpose. She was no longer Emma Sullivan of Cedar Falls or Ayana of the Comanche. She had become something new and unprecedented, a bridge between worlds who had found a way to honor all parts of her heritage, while serving something larger than herself. The healing center represented more than just a successful medical facility. It was a living symbol of the possibility that people from different backgrounds could learn to see their differences as sources of strength, rather than reasons for conflict. In a world that seemed increasingly divided by fear and misunderstanding, Emma had created a place where healing could occur on multiple levels, addressing not just physical ailments, but the deeper wounds that separated communities and cultures. As she prepared to close another successful day at the center, Emma touched the medicine bag that Windsinger had entrusted to her, feeling the presence of all the ancestors who had contributed to the knowledge she now carried. Their wisdom lived on through her work, but it was no longer confined to a single culture or tradition. It had become part of a larger healing that was slowly spreading across the frontier, one patient and one student at a time, building bridges of understanding that would endure long after the last conflicts between their peoples had been resolved. The following months brought challenges that tested the center's mission in ways Emma had never anticipated. A severe winter trapped several mixed groups of travelers at the facility for weeks, forcing people from hostile tribes and suspicious white communities to live in close quarters while depending on each other for survival. What could have been a recipe for disaster instead became an opportunity for deeper understanding as shared hardships broke down the barriers of prejudice and fear. During those long winter nights, stories were exchanged around communal fires that revealed the common humanity underlying cultural differences. Comanche warriors shared tales of their own families and losses, while white settlers spoke of the dreams and desperation that had driven them to seek new lives on the frontier. Children from both groups played together with the natural ease of youth unburdened by adult prejudices, creating friendships that would last throughout their lives. Emma found herself serving not just as a healer, but as a mediator in countless small conflicts that arose when people with fundamentally different worldviews were forced to coexist. A Comanche elder's insistence on conducting dawn prayers conflicted with a white family's need for quiet sleep. A settler woman's methods of disciplining her children clashed with tribal customs that emphasized different approaches to child rearing. Each situation required careful negotiation and creative compromise. The most significant breakthrough came when a blizzard trapped a mixed war party and a wagon train at the center simultaneously. The Comanche warriors had been pursuing the settlers to recover horses they claimed had been stolen, while the whites insisted they had purchased the animals in legitimate trades. Both groups arrived at the center armed and angry, prepared for violence that could have destroyed everything Emma had worked to build. Instead of allowing the confrontation to escalate, Emma proposed that both parties remain as her guests until the storm passed and the disputed ownership could be properly investigated. Her proposal was met with skepticism and outright hostility from both sides, but the severity of the weather made immediate departure impossible. and neither group was willing to violate the center's status as neutral territory. Over the course of a week, Emma gradually unraveled the complex chain of trades and misunderstandings that had led to the conflict. The horses in question had indeed been stolen, but not by the wagon train members who currently possessed them. They had purchased the animals in good faith from traders who had acquired them through a series of transactions that eventually traced back to the original theft, by members of a different tribe entirely. More importantly, Emma discovered that several members of both groups were suffering from a respiratory illness that threatened to become serious if left untreated. By focusing attention on the shared health crisis rather than the property dispute, she was able to create common ground that allowed both sides to work together toward a mutually beneficial solution. The healing process required cooperation between Comanche knowledge of medicinal plants and white understanding of quarantine procedures. Warriors and settlers found themselves working side by side to gather healing herbs, prepare medicines, and care for the sick. The shared experience of fighting illness together created bonds that transcended the cultural divisions that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. When the storm finally broke and both groups were free to leave, they did so with a negotiated settlement that satisfied everyone involved and a new understanding of their shared humanity. The wagon train members agreed to provide fair compensation for the inadvertently stolen horses, while the Comanche warriors acknowledged that the settlers had acted in good faith and deserved protection rather than punishment. More significantly, both groups became advocates for the healing center's mission, spreading word throughout their respective communities about the benefits of cross-cultural cooperation and the practical advantages of resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than violence. The winter that could have destroyed the center instead strengthened its reputation and expanded its influence throughout the region. Spring brought new opportunities and challenges as the center's reputation attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A delegation of military officers arrived from the territorial capital, sent by officials who were intrigued by reports of successful peaceful cooperation between whites and Indians. The officers were initially skeptical about the center's methods and suspicious of any arrangement that gave Native Americans access to white settlements without strict military supervision. Emma spent several tense days demonstrating the center's operations to these official visitors, knowing that their report could either lead to increased government support or result in restrictions that would cripple the facility's effectiveness. The key breakthrough came when one of the officers suffered a severe reaction to poison ivy that conventional medical treatment had been unable to relieve. Working with Dakota and several other traditional healers, Emma developed a treatment protocol that combined indigenous plant medicines with modern hygiene practices to provide rapid relief for the officer's condition. The dramatic improvement in his symptoms convinced even the most skeptical military observers that the center's methods had genuine practical value that extended beyond philosophical idealism. The officer's positive report led to official recognition of the Healing Center as a model facility for frontier medicine and intercultural cooperation. This recognition brought increased funding and resources, but also new scrutiny and expectations that challenged Emma to expand her mission while maintaining its core principles. The most significant expansion came with the establishment of satellite facilities in other locations across the territory. Emma found herself training other healers who could carry the center's methods to communities that were too distant to travel to the original Hot Springs location. Each new facility required careful adaptation of the basic model to local conditions and cultural dynamics. The satellite in the Eastern Territories served primarily white farming communities that were struggling with health problems related to poor nutrition and inadequate sanitation. Emma's students there focused on combining traditional plant medicines with improved hygiene practices and dietary modifications that addressed the root causes of illness rather than just treating symptoms. The Western Satellite was located in an area with a high concentration of mixed blood, families who faced unique challenges in both white and Native American communities. This facility specialized in addressing the psychological and spiritual healing needs of people caught between cultures. Drawing on Emma's own experience of navigating dual identities, the northern satellite served primarily nomadic tribes who maintained traditional lifestyles but needed access to medical techniques that could address injuries and illnesses that were beyond the scope of conventional tribal healing methods. This facility emphasized training traditional healers to incorporate new techniques while maintaining the spiritual foundations of their practices. Each satellite facility became a testing ground for new approaches to cross-cultural healing, and Emma found herself constantly learning from the innovations and adaptations developed by her students and colleagues. The network of facilities created a system for sharing knowledge and resources that benefited communities across the entire region. The success of the satellite system attracted international attention, with visitors arriving from as far away as Europe and Asia to study the center's methods and explore their potential application in other colonial situations around the world. Emma found herself hosting delegations of doctors, anthropologists, and government officials who were struggling with similar challenges in their own contexts. These international connections led to unexpected opportunities for expanding the center's knowledge base. A British doctor who had worked in India shared techniques for treating tropical diseases that proved adaptable to conditions on the American frontier. A French missionary who had lived among African tribes contributed insights into spiritual healing practices that resonated with Native American traditions. Most significantly, these international exchanges helped Emma understand that the challenges she was addressing were not unique to the American frontier. Throughout the world, indigenous peoples were struggling to preserve their traditional knowledge while adapting to the pressures of colonization and cultural change. The Healing Center's model of respectful integration rather than forced assimilation offered hope for communities facing similar challenges in many different contexts. The center's growing reputation also attracted critics who viewed its success as a threat to established power structures and cultural hierarchies. Some white settlers objected to the elevation of Native American healing methods to equal status with European medical traditions. Some tribal leaders worried that sharing sacred knowledge with outsiders would lead to its corruption or exploitation. Emma faced her most serious challenge when a coalition of conservative religious leaders from several white communities petitioned territorial authorities to shut down the center on grounds that it promoted pagan practices that were incompatible with Christian civilization. The petition was supported by some military officials who argued that the center's success in reducing conflicts between whites and Indians actually undermined efforts to establish clear boundaries between the races. The resulting investigation was intense and potentially devastating, with Emma required to defend every aspect of the center's operations before a panel of judges who had little sympathy for cross-cultural approaches to healing. The hearings lasted for weeks, with both supporters and critics testifying about the center's impact on their communities. The turning point came when Catherine Sullivan traveled from Cedar Falls to testify on Emma's behalf. Her simple but powerful testimony about the daughter she had raised and the woman Emma had become moved even the most skeptical panel members. Catherine's willingness to support Emma's choices, despite the personal cost to her own family, demonstrated the kind of love and wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries. Emma was always destined for something greater than the ordinary life we could offer her in Cedar Falls, Catherine told the panel. We knew from the beginning that she carried questions and dreams that would eventually lead her beyond our small world. The center she has built honors both her heritage and her upbringing, and it has brought healing to more people than any of us could have imagined when she first left home. The panel ultimately ruled in favor of the center, recognizing its contributions to regional peace and prosperity, while establishing guidelines that address the concerns of critics without compromising the facility's core mission. The ruling became a landmark decision that influenced policy toward Native American relations throughout the territory. As Emma reflected on the third anniversary of the center's establishment, she was amazed by how far her mission had expanded. Beyond her original vision, what had begun as a simple desire to learn from her dying grandmother had evolved into a movement that was transforming relationships between peoples throughout the region and beyond. The center now employed over 50 people from diverse backgrounds, treated hundreds of patients annually, and had trained dozens of healers who carried its methods to communities across multiple territories. The economic impact alone was significant, with the center serving as a hub for trade and cultural exchange that benefited everyone in the surrounding region. But the most meaningful changes were often the smallest and most personal. Emma treasured the letters she received from former patients whose lives had been transformed by their experiences at the center. A Comanche warrior who had learned to read from Jonathan Whitaker while recovering from his injuries. A white settler woman who had adopted traditional Native American child-rearing practices that strengthened her relationship with her troubled son. A mixed-blood trader who had found peace with his complex identity and become a successful mediator in his own community. The center had also facilitated marriages between people from different cultures who might never have met otherwise, creating a new generation of children who grew up naturally bicultural and served as living bridges between their parents' worlds. These children would face their own challenges as they matured, but they would do so with advantages that neither purely white nor purely Native American children possessed. Standing in the garden where medicinal plants from multiple traditions grew side by side in carefully planned harmony, Emma felt the presence of Windsinger's spirit in the evening breeze that carried the mingled scents of sage and lavender, wild roses and healing herbs. Her grandmother's prophecy had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. But Emma knew that the work was far from finished. The frontier was changing rapidly, with new settlers arriving daily and traditional Native American ways of life under increasing pressure from expanding white civilization. The center's mission of building bridges between cultures would become more important rather than less as these changes accelerated, requiring constant adaptation and innovation to remain relevant and effective. Emma smiled as she watched Dakota emerge from the main building with their newest student, a young Lakota woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to learn the center's methods for addressing trauma in her own community. The circle of healing that had begun with two lost sisters finding each other was expanding outward in ripples that would continue long after Emma and Dakota had joined their ancestors in the spirit world. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky as Emma completed her daily rounds of the center, checking on patients, reviewing the next day's schedule, and ensuring that all was prepared for another night of peaceful rest in this place, where enemies had learned to become friends and strangers had discovered their common humanity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to extend the healing that had begun in a burning wagon on a distant prairie, but tonight there was peace, and that was enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.